Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 69 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. Janir entered the banquet hall of Jorman Nufar, flanked closely by Cerilius and Canicade. They still had not returned her carcatan, but she expected her father to keep those until he thought he could trust her. That could be never. Jorman Nufar ate in the luxury of a monarch. His dining hall was an ornate example of Tathansian craftsmanship, demonstrating the skills of master masons, sculptors, and painters. Reliefs adorned the walls, and mosaics sparkled in the lamplight. Tathansians must treat their enchanters much better than Brevia. There was none of the austere, brooding architecture Janir had seen, but rather excitement and celebration. The Tathansians were descended of a deposed tribe across the sea who had come to Brevia generations ago. The king at the time had allowed them to settle the otherwise uninhabited rainforests. Over time, they had gradually intermarried, and their culture had been diluted with Slavish and Brevian. Janir's tutors had said that Tathansian ways held no more in common with their motherland than Argetallam did with their ancestral Brevian. Whether that was true or not, the Tathansians seemed different enough to her eyes. They still allied themselves with other peoples rarely, which left them vulnerable to whomever went through the trouble of slogging into the wilds. The Argetallams around the table were a perfect example. Instead of chairs, the diners were seated on cushions laid on the floor, whilst the low table was heaped with fruits, meats, breads, and delicacies befitting honored guests. Jorman Nufar was already present, presiding over the foot of the table, while the Lord Argetallam claimed the host's usual seat at the head. Half of the table claimed by the Lord Argetallam was dominated by the Argetallams, in their embroidered yet undeniably martial attire. The other half was occupied by enchanters and enchantresses, who shrank from the presence of their companions. There was no sign of Zamarza. In truth, Janir had sensed nothing of Zamarza since they had arrived. Janir was ushered to a place at the table to sit beside Drusilla, and quickly boxed in by Cerilius on her other side. She kept a brave face and tried to show nothing. Her father wanted her alive, and he was willing to bargain for her cooperation, but he could change his mind about either of those things in an instant. That would mean certain death for Saoven and the others. She would do whatever he wanted. "I'm so glad you could join us, Princess Janir." The Lord Argetallam smoothly greeted her. "Yes, my lord," she meekly responded, not sure if that had been the correct response or not. The Lord Argetallam seemed displeased with her reply, but made no comment. Janir sat quietly with her hands in her lap, and head angled downwards, not sure where to look. They were joined by several more enchanters. It seemed that Jorman's followers were not eager for this meal. Their magic burned bright and strong, if not as strongly as Jorman's or Zamarza's. If ordinary people were sheep, then enchanters were wolves. If enchanters were wolves, Argetallams were lions. In Brevia, the only legal place where magic was taught was within the walls of the enchanter temples. Rules were more lenient for seeresses, clairvoyants, and lower-level users such as Carlisle, but magic was still regarded as a thing to be kept in check. After meeting Zamarza, Janir understood that school of thought, but, thinking back to Lord Dulmarst's words, if the Brevians were simply on more friendly terms with Argetallams, they would never need fear rogue magic users again. The way she saw it, everyone would be more free if Argetallams were allowed into Brevia, with laws to prevent rampant claiming and abuse, of course. Then again, Argetallams had been outcasts for hundreds of years. Perhaps things were this way because they could not be any other way. Once everyone was finally assembled, servants came bearing trays and platters of ornate and succulent dishes. Janir didn't recognize most of the dishes, but the smell was tantalizing. The trays were passed by the Argetallams, then Jormungand Nufar's enchanters, giving the Mortons and Mortanas first choice. Janir let Cerilius pile strange foods on her plate while she watched. She probably wouldn't eat half of it. How could she feast in the presence of foes while Saoven, Armandius, Carlisle, and the others were in the dungeons, picking through stale bread if they were lucky? The Lord Argetallam began speaking with one of the Mortons to his left. Their conversation seemed purely recreational by their expressions, and soon all the Argetallams at the table were taking part, minus Janir. Her mouth was dry, and she reached across her plate for a goblet of fruit nectar. She briefly glanced up and caught a familiar face. Lucan stared back at her, reserved, neutral. Lucan had saved her life. He had been good to her in Valmaken. Yet Carlisle had said her brother tried to kill her only months before. Lucan was the only other invulnerable not participating in the table conversation. As always, there was something silent and observant about him. He was a good fighter, never hesitated, and always did his utmost to please his father. Why, then, would the Lord Argetallam be so set on having her as his heir? Was it truly because of the power that ran through her blood? Did her father plan to kill her as soon as she produced an heir? The idea was more than a little unsettling. She glanced covertly to her father at the head of the table. Despite everything, there was a part of her that wished she could please him, wished she could make him proud. That was the part that she least understood. The Lord Argetallam looked up. Janir was consumed by the sensation that there was nothing she could hide from him, not even her fear. When he looked like that, Janir didn't feel he planned to kill her at all. He just wanted to control her. He wanted to own her. After dinner, the Argetallams and the Tathansian enchanters went their separate ways, diverging to their respective parts of the temple. Janir walked behind her father, blocked in by Cerilius on one side and Canicade on the other. She kept her head bent just enough to avoid looking at anyone, hands loose at her sides. The Lord Argetallam was speaking to Drusilla about lower defenses and the enchanter's progress repairing the chalice. Something to do with unstable amounts of frayed magic in the temple's lower levels. Janir didn't understand the conversation, and nor did she desire to. The Lord Argetallam drew to an abrupt halt. "These are your chambers," he stated, motioning to the door at his side. "I will send for you in the morning. Now go." Canicade opened the door, and Cerilius ushered her in. Janir called over her shoulder, "Where is Saoven?" "He is alive and well, as per our arrangement," the Lord Argetallam answered. "And the others?" Janir pressed, anxiety rattling her voice. "They put up a bit of a fight, but aside from a few cuts and scratches, they are none the worse for the wear." "I want to see them." The Lord Argetallam cocked his head to the side. "Please," she contritely added. If she wasn't careful, it would be her, or worse, Saoven or Carlisle, who would pay the price. "Please, may I see him? May I see all of them?" "Do you not trust me?" It was a challenge, an oblique threat. After a moment, she gave what she hoped was a diplomatic response. "I would want to see them whether I trusted you or not." The Lord Argetallam glanced to Cerilius. "Take her to the elf." Cerilius inclined his head in respect. "Yes, my lord." He grasped Janir's wrist and led her back down the hall, Canicade in tow. "Oh, and Janir." Cerilius drew up short at the Lord Argetallam's words, and Janir obediently turned to face her father. "If you breathe a word of the chalice to any of them, I shall have their tongues cut out to keep the secret. Are we clear?" The Lord Argetallam would do it too. Janir didn't doubt that for a second. She nodded compliantly. "Go then." Her father waved a hand, excusing her like a troublesome child. As she followed after Ceruleus, Janir wondered what she would say to Saoven and the others. How would she explain herself? What would their reactions be? Would they feel betrayed? Canicade flanked them. His injury from Valmachen appeared healed. He no longer walked with a limp. Ceruleus took her through a long hallway detailed with mosaics. They passed Jorman Nufar, surrounded by a retinue of lackeys and attendants. The high priest stood before a large mural of an ancient battle scene, elaborating the story of Malvrin's defeat. Janir knew most the story and recognized the tail end. As punishment, Malvrin was chained at the feet of the Father Creator's throne. The high priest pointed to a portrait of the Essence, groveling in chains at the feet of a white-robed figure. Turning back to face his students, Jorman continued. The chalice channels his power, but retains a link to him through... Nufar trailed off as he caught sight of the 3 Argetallams. The old enchanter opened his mouth, but then Ceruleus's steely glare met his, and the man must have changed his mind. The Mortons took Janir to a lower story that was probably 1 or 2 above the ground level. This portion of the temple was dank and dark, a drastic change from the bright and airy halls above. It reeked of mold and putrefaction, bringing back vague recollections of sewers. They passed a pockmarked jailer, shaded from the light of the single lantern by matted black hair. He grunted in acknowledgement as the 3 Argetallams passed, either too lazy or too intimidated to question their motives. The dimly lit corridor was lined on one side by stone cells, heavy wooden doors bolted shut with iron padlocks. All was silent, but Janir already knew her companions were here. The dappled magic of elves, Cariel's steady flame, and a vague halo of topaz power led the way. Ceruleus stopped before the 3rd door, still holding her wrist. This is where the elf is being held. At his voice, someone stirred from inside the cell. A moment later, a familiar face was framed in the barred window. Janir! Saoven exclaimed. Janir! Another voice quickly followed, and the top of Cariel's head bobbed in sight. Janir tore away from Ceruleus and rushed to the front of the cell, grasping their hands between the bars. Janir, what's going on? Are you all right? Did they feed you? Are they going to feed us? Are they going to kill us? Do I really have to share a cell with... Cariel! Saoven snapped, cutting off the enchanter's slew of questions. Janir gripped Saoven's hand until her fingers went numb. Janir? Armandius shouted from one of the cells further down the aisle. I'm fine, Janir shouted back. Is everyone else here? Yes, Velasquez replied from the next cell over. Lady Gwenna as well. I am well. Gwenna sounded a little weak and tired, but very much alive. Janir, Armandius called. What's going on? No yelling, a harsh voice bellowed from further down the corridor. Or I'll come down there with my whip. Cariel leaned closer and dropped to a whisper. I can't imagine a finer fellow to keep us locked up. Janir didn't have the energy to appreciate her friend's indomitable humor. You'll keep your arse on that stool or endure my carcotton, Ceruleus yelled back at the pockmarked man. This is none of your concern. Even in the dim light of the prison, Saoven's murderous glare for Ceruleus could not be missed. Janir. Saoven leaned closer. What is happening? Janir swallowed. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. She took a deep breath. My father has... She shot an instinctive glance over her shoulder to Ceruleus and Canicade, but neither appeared to care what she told them so long as she didn't tell them about the chalice. Janir turned back to Saoven and Cariel. My father has promised to release you. All of you. She forced an encouraging smile. For the briefest of moments, surprise and hope shone on both their faces. But it didn't last. What did you do? Cariel demanded. What did you promise them? Janir faltered. Janir. Saoven kept his voice down out of habit. not wanting to make it easy for the other Argetallams to overhear. I won't be going with you, she confessed. Both of them started talking at once, protesting with equal passion, and she could hardly make any sense of what they were saying. She ripped her hands away and held them up in a plea. This is the only way. Her voice threatened to crack, but she refused to let it. If I go back to the Staspen Waste with them, they let you go. You'll be safe. All of you. Janir, you'll be all right, Janir assured them. You'll be fine. She looked away from them before she broke down. You'll be safe. Janir, you cannot trust him, Saoven cried, clawing at the bars. What is this? Janir, what's happening? Further down the aisle, Armandius banged on the door of his cell. Janir bit her lip, holding back tears. I have to, she whispered. Kyle elbowed Saoven out of the way to have a better view. Janir, what if they make you forget us again? There was a fear to his words that made her heart wrench in her chest. Janir glanced to Cerilius, watching her stoically as a statue. I don't know, she softly answered. I just know that this is the only choice I have. You can't, Saoven cried. He said something rushed in Elvish that she didn't quite catch. We'll find another way. There is no other way, she screamed. He holds you, all of you, by the throat, and unless I do as he wants, he's going to hurt you until I obey. Don't you see? Don't you understand? There is no other way. Janir turned around and ran before Saoven could answer. He and Kyle clamored, their words overlapping and drowning each other in their urgency. Armandius was shouting, and Velasquez yelled over top of him. Cerilius and Kanakade caught up with her back at the residential level, though they had never fallen more than a few paces behind. Janir doubled over, her body shaking with sobs as she lost control and let her tears fall. Ruined. It was all ruined. Her future, Brevia's future, everything. Janir covered her face with her hands. She hated herself for weeping yet again in front of her guards, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop it. A warm hand rested on her shoulder. It startled her. Cerilius's mouth compressed into a mild grimace, uncertainly. Janir shrugged off his arm before he could finish. I'm supposed to be back in my rooms, aren't I? She clipped. With that, she spun away from them, marching back in the direction of her chambers. Kanakade and Cerilius quickly caught up and forced her to walk between the two of them. Janir felt a pang of guilt that she would be spending the night in a plush feather bed, whilst her friends spent the night in the cold, dank dungeons. Perhaps if she... No. She did not want to draw any more attention to them than she had already. She would not mention it to her father.
You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.